Welcome to today's webinar, Anti-Abortion and Pro-Insurrection, How White Supremacists, Male Supremacists, and Anti-Abortionists Converged at the Capitol. I'm Lynn Paltrow. I'm the founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. We are a nonprofit organization and we specialize in reproductive justice legal advocacy. We provide pro bono legal defense in our efforts to ensure that no one is arrested or dehumanized because of their capacity for pregnancy, or any outcome of pregnancy. We are thrilled to have with us again Professor Carol Mason. I met Carol many years ago when we were both working at Planned Parenthood of New York City. Carol was turning her dissertation into her first book. She is now a professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Kentucky and faculty affiliate of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. She's written 3 books on the rise of the right. She has served as an NAPW board member. And when she was teaching at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma, she listened to her students and launched what would become the Take Root Red State Perspectives on Reproductive Justice Conference. That conference is now sponsored by the Kentucky Health Justice Network. I met Loretta Ross even before that, when I was a Georgetown Women's Law and Public Policy Fellow in Washington, D.C., and she was working at the National Organization for Women. Professor Ross is a visiting associate professor at Smith College in the program for the study of women and gender. Through her online courses, she is giving thousands of people the benefit of her brilliance. She is an activist, a public intellectual, and a scholar. She is the author of numerous books about reproductive justice, and she is the co-creator of the comprehensive human rights reproductive justice vision. She started her career in social activism in such organizations as the National Black Women's Health Project and the Center for Democratic Renewal, their national anti-Klan network. Carol will speak first. She will be recapping and updating the talk she gave on January 29th. If you've heard some of it before, please blame me. I have asked her to talk again, to repeat and recap much of what she said. It was so helpful. And as we all know, the way we really learn and think is by hearing things over and over again, giving us a better opportunity to more deeply understand and incorporate. Her presentation will be followed by commentary and analysis from Professor Ross and discussions and questions after that. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And also that would be the best place to post questions that you have. If for any reason we get disconnected with Zoom, please just sign back on. And I will turn it over now to Carol Mason.
Righty, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I appreciate that generous introduction, Lynn. And I wanted to shout out to Sean Steiner, who's been wrangling all the technology for today's webinar. I'm thrilled to share the Zoom stage with Loretta Ross. And I want to thank Lynn Paltrow for inviting me to speak today. As she said, Lynn and I have known each other since the 1990s. When I started to study the right, race, and reproduction. And a lot of the information I'll share with you is research I conducted back then. I had not known then that it would still be relevant today. But some of it is offensive material. So consider this your trigger warning. I'm going to be showing some offensive racist, anti-Semitic, ableist, nativist, and misogynist stuff. And in no way do I condone these images I'm going to show you, but as a scholar and a citizen, I think it's important to acknowledge and analyze why and how right-wing materials work. Otherwise, we can only be reactive to incidents like the insurrection. I'm going to share my screen now. So for some of you, the events on January 6th, 2021 were an unprecedented attack on our democracy. For a lot of us in the reproductive justice community, however, the insurrection was like, oh, another day at the clinic, only bigger. Or you may have had a horrific recognition. Wow, so they finally all got together. And I suspect some of you had these reactions because the reproductive justice community has been subjected to domestic terrorism for decades and to racist terror for centuries. So in this presentation, I will discuss 5 points at which various factions of right-wing America changed tactics, aims, or language in ways that facilitated a convening of all those factions for the first time in such numbers in the storming of the Capitol. The media's coverage of the January 6th siege has largely left out anti-abortion militants who were there at the Capitol and who have been perpetuating or advocating domestic terrorism for a long time under the guise of saving babies. And so you see, there's been a lot of press coverage of white supremacists, of patriot militias, of Christian nationalists, and of militant conspiracists, or otherwise known as QAnon followers. And what we know is that abortion opponents overlap and intersect with all of these. The pro-life presence in Washington on January 6th has been underreported. Plenty were there at the Capitol on January 6th. For example, anti-abortionist John Brokaw, a clinic arsonist associated with the Army of God, joined other anti-abortion militants such as Chad Estes, Bobby Lee, and Dave Dobenmeyer, who said he had a crew of about 100, 120 people with him. West Virginia politician Derek Evans, who was arrested for his involvement in the insurrection, had in 2019 violated a restraining order issued to prevent his harassment of an abortion clinic worker. And Taylor Hanson, a proponent of Baby Lives Matter, is visible in the horrifying footage of Ashley Babbitt's death at Capitol Police as she attempted to enter the speaker's lobby outside the House chamber. Abortion Access Fronts has been identifying the most notorious anti-abortionists stoking insurrectionary fever, many of whom call for further violence and civil war. Numerous representatives from other anti-abortion organizations attended the Trump rally prior to the storming of the Capitol. How did these abortion militants come to join other factions of the right at the Capitol? How did all the different right-wing factions convene, if not coordinate, on January 6, 2021? Well, the short answer, you know, is Trump. But the longer answer entails a little history. And today I'm going to give you a brief history that in presenting 5 turning points in right-wing America on the road to insurrection. So by turning points, I mean turning points necessarily in time, but in ideas. I mean redirection in thought, new tactics, or outlooks that led to a more militant way. In the first turning point, I will explain how white supremacists redefined who their worst enemy was, changing their focus from African Americans to Jews. In the second turning point, which I call paramilitarizing pro-life, I will explain how the pro-life movement shifted to a more militant, more vigilant, leaderless resistance. In the third turning point, which I call junking science, I will examine how the anti-abortion movement turned away from moral and religious arguments and deployed junk science, the corruption of scientific thought. The fourth turning point, I call trolling Satan, shows how apocalyptic stories about satanic forces shift from anti-abortion to QAnon communities. And the fifth turning point, called defying tyranny, I will show how the anti-abortion militants dispense with the right to life and pro-life arguments to take up the fight against tyranny, which they share with other factions of the oppositional far right. So as I discuss each of these 5 turning points, you'll see some common ground among anti-abortion militants and other far right factions that were emboldened by Trump. So let's begin with one of the most widely recognized American terrorist organizations, the Ku Klux Klan. And so you'll see here a picture, and you may recognize this picture and you may automatically go like, oh, okay, that's a picture of the Klan. And a lot of you know a lot about the Klan. You know, perhaps that the Klan began during Reconstruction as a concerted effort to thwart the economic power of African Americans and immigrants. You may also know that in the 1910s and 20s, it was a largely middle-class Christian organization comprised of white businessmen and their wives. 50 years later, by the time that the Supreme Court ruled on Roe versus Wade, the Klan was in disarray. They had historically low membership and they needed reorganization and rededication. What resulted was called the Nazification of the Klan. The Nazification of the Klan generally refers to the unification of a variety of white supremacist groups coming together under the umbrella of the Aryan nations at the end of the 70s. But this picture, which was taken in February 1975 during a textbook controversy in West Virginia, check this out. Notice that, of course, these are Klansmen. You can see by their pointy hoods and their robes, you can unmistakably see the Klansmen's regalia. And of course, the burning cross is a hallmark of white terror and racist Klan terror. But also notice that the Klansmen are raising their hand in a Nazi salute. And this is witness to the shift in Klan focus and belief that the so-called international Jew was, even more so than Blacks or communists, the white man's enemy. And clearly the white power movement was consolidating earlier than most scholars recognize, or at least we can say that their outlook was shifting earlier in the 70s than most scholars recognize. It was shifting away from an American-only Christian outlook that earlier would have rejected Hitler's German ideology and Nazi paganism. It was shifting toward anti-Semitism and seeing Jews as the real enemy. So this anti-Semitism was reflected in obscure anti-abortion material from the 1970s and the 1980s. I have two artifacts here. And the first is a book by Paul Marks, in which he blatantly told people, quote, note the large numbers of abortionists and pro-abortion medical professors who are Jewish, end quote. In another publication titled Pro-Abortion Jews and the New Holocaust, Marx referred to, quote, the nefarious satanic dishonesties of the death peddlers, unquote. The result was a defamation of both Jews and reproductive health care professionals. And this defamation is something that Marx exported overseas as founder of Human Life International. Human Life International was one of a variety of Christian organizations that shifted from missionary work to politics in the 1970s. Such international Christian work carried on the colonialist legacy of civilizing the supposed barbaric sexuality of the so-called Dark Continent. The Apostles for Jesus, for example, had more than 30 dioceses in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Sudan, South Africa, and Ethiopia. So despite doctrinal and denominational differences among religious stances against abortion, right-to-life rhetoric emerged as a way of consolidating promotion of patriarchal traditionalism that saw abortion as a sin, not unlike divorce or premarital sex. The global pro-life network begun in the 1970s saw the state as an ally and sought legislative reform to criminalize abortion or to reduce access to it. But the white supremacism it spread also accommodated, if not encouraged, anti-state, anti-government views all around the world. So in this second book cover pictured here, you can see how this defamation pronounces abortion as the real Holocaust, thereby suggesting that the Nazis' genocide of Jews was a fake Holocaust. The anti-Semitic portrayal of abortion providers goes hand in hand with Holocaust denial. You can see in this second cover how the abortion provider, with features that are stereotypically anti-Semitic, how he is standing outside the clinic and throwing baby-sized coffins into a mass grave. The sign that this is Dr. Herod's clinic is a nod to the biblical story of how King Herod killed all newborns the night Christ was born. This anti-Semitic depiction of physicians as Jews who kill children is a version of the ancient anti-Semitic myth of blood libel, about which I'll say more when we get to QAnon. This idea that abortion is a Jewish engineered white genocide feeds people's fears of demographic decline. And the US anti-abortion movement has spread this fear worldwide. The World Congress of Families, for example, is a US organization that has collaborated with Russian oligarchs and policymakers who believe that the high birth rate among Muslims in Russia will bring about the end of Christian civilization. The recently deceased Joseph Scheidler exported his militant tactics to Ireland, as did Americans United for Life and a slew of female abortion opponents who worked to thwart the repeal of Ireland's ban on abortion. The fear of demographic decline fuels both anti-abortionists and white supremacists. Currently, the way white supremacists refer to this supposed white genocide is by calling it the Great Replacement. If you recall, all the tiki torch carrying white supremacists in Charlottesville in 2017 chanting, "You will not replace us, Jew will not replace us." That is the updated version of the anti-Semitic hatred you see pictured here. The shift from seeing African Americans as the white people's worst enemy to seeing the so-called international Jew as their worst enemy is the turning point I'm trying to get across here. And here's another artifact. This is a 70s version of what it meant to promote the anti-Semitic idea that the so-called international Jew is secretly running the federal government. And this is really important because we now have an increase in oppositional right who see the federal government not as as something that they want to take control over, but as the problem they want to not only be part of the power of federal government, but to overthrow it. So this is President Jimmy Carter, and there's a call to unite against the secret cabal that is controlling the president. This is a reproduction of a flyer that first appeared in '77. And it says, "Did you know that Jews in America are less than 5% of the total population, but hold over 90% of top government jobs? The implication is that Jews are secretly in charge." And the flyer specifies that it's not only the government, the Jews are supposedly in control of news media, the banks, and remarkably, it even says the churches. The old anti-Semitic myth of Jewish financiers is evident in this flyer, as is the assertion that the Jews control the news and the entertainment media. Of course, at the time, this was difficult to convince people that the first president who called himself a born-again Christian was really in cahoots with Jews running the country, the media, and the money. But this call to unite against the federal government did not fall on deaf ears for those who believed in an invisible government, or what we now call a deep state. Anti-government sentiment was beginning to spread in the late 1970s. Anti-government sentiment flourished especially among soldiers returning from Vietnam who believed that the feds did not let them win the war in Vietnam. Those soldiers returning with their knowledge of combat and their love of military culture that they felt the feds betrayed. The result, paramilitary groups. So paramilitarization in general and the paramilitarization of pro-life is another turning point on the road to insurrection. With the end of the Vietnam War, the idea that the federal government didn't let the soldiers win in Vietnam came home. That anti-federal government idea spread among the newly consolidated white supremacists, but also among anti-abortionists who considered the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade an act of federal overreach. Abortion foes began to have mass demonstrations to close down clinics, and then they started to make bombs. Then some so-called lone wolves took matters into their own vigilante hands and killed a number of physicians and clinic workers. They called it justifiable homicide. These snipers shared the idea of leaderless resistance with their patriot militia counterparts. And so this cartoon that you see here from Paul DePerry's Life Advocate magazine shows two things, I believe. First, it displays the misogyny that is basic to the whole anti-abortion enterprise by reducing the pregnant woman to a landscape on which a battle is fought. And if you look at this picture, you notice that it's a shootout. it's a shootout like an Old West shootout, like a Western, or like the standoff at Ruby Ridge, the infamous battle between the Weavers and the federal government that marshaled so much support for the militia movement. The second thing that this cartoon demonstrates is how militant, murderous abortion foes see themselves as victim and warrior, as both victim and warrior. A good example of this is John Brokaw, who imagined himself in the place of the fetus before he went on a bombing campaign to destroy abortion clinics. A former soldier who served in Vietnam, Brokaw channeled his military training into his anti-abortion terrorist campaign. While the Patriot militia movement grew in response to government-led fiascos like Ruby Ridge and the firebombing of David Koresh's compound in Waco, Texas, paramilitarized pro-lifers saw themselves as victim warriors. They saw the unborn not only as individual babies needing rescue, but also as a collectivity, the future of the nation. In their mind, protecting the unborn with lethal force was defending their idea of America. Killing for life was not mere hypocrisy, it was a restoration of God's order. Or at least that's what the Army of God said. The Army of God embraced a decentralized, leaderless resistance style just as Patriot militias did. The Army of God was more of a mindset than a member organization. As the name suggests, the Army of God militarized religious allegiance, and it was decentralized. There was no governing board or leader calling the shots. It wasn't even a network of cells or concrete doctrine, but more a commitment to take direct action as so-called lone wolves, or at least to make it look like individual actors. The Army of God manual was a how-to tactical guide for bombing clinics and shooting physicians. In the late 1990s, 7 reproductive health care workers were shot by increasingly sophisticated paramilitary tactics. Had we not experienced the bombing of the World Trade Towers on September 11, 2001, and had we not all therefore got schooled in what terrorist tactics are, I believe the anti-abortion murders would have accelerated. But since we did have 9/11, there was a lull in anti-abortion homicides until 2009. It should come as no surprise that when another anti-abortion murder occurred in 2009, that the perpetrator had been involved in both pro-life and patriot militia groups decades earlier. Dr. George Tiller was gunned down after years of conservatives calling him Tiller the Killer. Like former President Trump's incendiary language, calling the physician Tiller the Killer was inflammatory rhetoric that incited violence, perpetuated by someone who had trained with militia and with anti-abortion groups. The paramilitarization of pro-life was a turning point that shifted a prayerful protest movement into a faction of anti-government terrorism and the oppositional far right. So the third turning point is about how the anti-abortion movement turned away from moral and religious arguments and deployed junk science, and I call it junking science. If you've ever run across pro-life material that suggested that abortion causes breast cancer or severe mental health problems, you've encountered the corruption of scientific thought that the pro-life movement perpetuates. Also, as the folks at NARAL have detailed in their recent project, The Lie That Binds, career abortion foe John Wilkie popularized many ideas that are not medically accurate, constituting big lies about conception, rape, and abortion procedures that have endured through generations. But I want to focus not on any of those examples and look at the photo that I have for you here. I took this photo in Louisville in 2017. It's a truck. And I want you to take a look at what's underneath the picture of the baby. Note the words "just say no" under the question vaccinations. In the 1980s and 90s, "just say no" was the motto for the war on drugs. Concurrent with the 1990s paramilitarization of anti-government militants then was this other military sounding campaign called the War on Drugs. And the War on Drugs deployed junk science to criminalize drug use, demonize pregnant people, and justify mass incarceration. All of this had implicit and often overt racial bias. The myth of the so-called crack baby prevailed in this effort of the war on drugs, rendering Black women the worst threat to their own pregnancy and to their children. And today we see this same junk science deployed in prosecutions of so-called meth moms and pregnant opioid users. The war on drugs perpetuated junk science and coincided with the anti-abortion movement's corruption of scientific thought. So here again, we see that same picture I showed you just a second ago, that the war on drugs motto, just say no, is recycled to assault the science behind vaccinations. The road to anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers was paved with anti-abortion contempt for facts, corruption of scientific thought, and a deployment of junk science that has made pregnancy a crime for anyone who cannot afford a legal team to debunk the junk. Consider the long-term effect of this contempt for facts. Would we be seeing reports of medical workers sabotaging COVID-19 vaccinations if so-called conscience clauses hadn't already been written into law? Such laws allow corporations to refuse health care and health insurance to employees if it provides contraception. Turning away from facts and deploying junk science is another turning point on the road to Trumpism. Okay, so we've done 3 out of 5. We're on to number 4. The fourth turning point involves how apocalyptic stories about satanic forces shift from anti-abortion to QAnon communities. And I call this fourth point trolling Satan. This migration of such apocalyptic stories, excuse me, involves what some journalists call satanic panic and what I call trolling Satan. I call it trolling Satan because I want to emphasize how conspiracist fears of satanic forces circulate in digital spaces and on social media. For example, this video, Abortion, a Doctrine of Demons, posted on YouTube, purports to be a documentary film detailing how supposed Satanists use abortion in ritualistic blood sacrifices. And if this myth doesn't sound familiar to you, you haven't been listening to the folks who stormed the Capitol. Among the insurrectionists were male victim warriors called intactivists who oppose circumcision. Look at how one intactivist depicts the fight against circumcision in the comic book Foreskin Man. Foreskin Man is an Aryan superhero disrupting the ritualized attack on a baby boy by a villain overtly portrayed as an evil Jew. The anti-Semitism here echoes the same concerns about white children as victims that motivated other insurrectionists. Look at this photo from the January 6th Capitol siege. You see the woman holding a sign indicating her allegiance to Q, or is it to the pro-life movement? We don't know because both perpetuate an idea that the children cry out for justice. I believe the QAnon conspiracy theory is a version of anti-abortion, anti-Semitic stories. They have circulated for decades in pro-life videos, fiction, memoir, and memes. Even if rates of terminating pregnancies are at a historic low, as they have been, abortions are depicted as more frequent and more barbaric than ever before, because purportedly Satanists organize them in accordance with the doctrine of demons, as one group currently sells it. So here's another example. This elaborate poster art depicting a fight over Texas abortion legislation in 2013, during which Wendy Davis filibustered for 10 hours, clearly equates abortion with bloody child sacrifice. Each of these artifacts, the Doctrine of Demons video, Foreskin Man, and the child sacrifice poster seen here, are repackaging of the aforementioned ancient anti-Semitic myth, the blood libel, purporting that Jews kill babies as a sacrificial rite. For decades, anti-abortionists have implied and sometimes outright claimed that abortion is a satanic Jewish-run cabal. And this portrayal blends with the anti-Semitic myth I spoke of earlier, that of the Jewish cabal secretly controlling the government and the media. Like QAnon conspiracism, such artifacts pit a satanic cabal craving baby flesh against humble heroes who can see what less enlightened people supposedly cannot. Moreover, in the digital age, these images and stories become a matter of fan fiction, a matter of people joining the creation of them. This participatory aspect of social media, I think, has historical precedence. But that participatory aspect of social media not only creates echo chambers, but also allows people to adapt even the oldest myths to their current situation. The so-called Manosphere is a network of social media platforms that espouse overt misogyny and proliferate a variety of male supremacism, including incels, patriarchal traditionalism, and male tribalism. Their methods of attacking women via the internet is called doxing, which is to post personal information and put out a call to participate in a collective harassment that becomes an onslaught of death threats and rape threats. For those of us in the reproductive justice movement, we recognize doxing as derived exactly from harassment of reproductive health care providers. Back in the 1990s, well before Gamergate, which is a very notorious example of doxing, abortion foes would use the internet to post personal information about reproductive health care providers. And consistent with their penchant for denying the Holocaust, they called this website the Nuremberg Files. The Nuremberg Files listed the names of physicians who provided reproductive health care, and when one of them was shot and killed, they'd put a red line through the name so all could see and revel in this killing. So I want to emphasize the participatory aspect of it. And that participatory aspect is as old as mob rule of lynching parties and as fresh as the newest forms of trolling on social media. The radicalizing effect of trolling is this participatory aspect of social media. And that sense of being part of something and that sense of belonging to the moment overrides often actual facts. There was a debate about trolling on Reddit. They debated whether posting on social media, quote, counts as trolling if you actually believe the things you say, unquote. This debate raises the question about why calls for harassment and conspiracist theories are spread. It raises the question about how and why satanic panic is spread. Do abortion opponents and QAnon groups actually believe the satanic panic they incite? Or are they just getting others to write along with them, to co-write an apocalyptic narrative, to ride along with them on the path toward insurrection? So finally, are you still with me? I saw an important shift. This is my fifth turning point, defying tyranny. I saw an important shift in anti-abortion language that made it all the easier to bring in a variety of right-wing factions under one government, under one anti-government revolutionary roof. It's the idea of portraying the federal government as tyrannical and calling on citizens and lower-ranking officials to defy tyranny. You see in this photo an image of a policeman under which the text reads, "We must obey God rather than man." Is the policeman the one we should not obey? Or is the policeman part of the we who should obey only God? This was another picture I took in Louisville in 2017 when abortion opponents descended on the one remaining abortion clinic in the state, hoping to make Kentucky the first state with no access to abortion. Rusty Thomas from Operation Save America and Matthew Truella were prominent leaders, and each made coded and overt appeals to the police as lower rank officials to defy the law. They were appealing to the police in the context of all the Black Lives Matter protests. And they were suggesting that not only the so-called blue lives should defy laws, but also that government officials should defy the law. Our Governor Bevin met with pro-life leaders who gave him a book called The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates. Now, on one hand, the cry of tyranny belongs to no specific group or era, but abortion opponents' embrace of fighting tyranny at this historical moment is significant. In this book, the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates asserts not a right to life based on human rights, that old 1970s innovation, not a pro-life agenda, which has been abandoned for its incrementalism, but an abolitionist agenda to defy law, to defy tyrants. In this way, some abortion opponents who were gathered in Louisville were articulating a shift away from system-loyal politics that hopes to sway the political system to their cause, and shifting toward an oppositional revolutionary right that sees the current political system as the problem. The hope of sharing this doctrine was to enlist law enforcement and state officials to go rogue. And this is exactly what we saw at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, a first ever convening of all types of anti-government factions, all positioning themselves as victim warriors, acting with an apocalyptic fever in defiance of the law and in defiance of our electoral process. So as the United States ushered in a new administration only a week after violent insurrection propelled by lies, it's clear that we need a national rededication to facts. But correcting widespread misinformation is not enough when people are wrapped up in a story that tells them they are heroic resistors to tyrannical power. We're seeing both religious and secular militants embrace an apocalyptic sense of conflict between dark and light, absolute evil and absolute righteousness. The same violent brew of paramilitary warriors, white supremacists, and Christian militants that we saw descending on the Capitol building merged in a smaller way to oppose abortion with lethal force years ago. Pro-lifers who committed arson and murder also have been militia members and Holocaust deniers. The defense of their lethal action often appropriates abolitionist and anti-segregationist history. Some anti-abortionists denounce Black Lives Matter as anti-Christian, even as they call themselves freedom riders or champions of civil rights. Other anti-abortion groups use pictorial icons that they deny look like neo-Nazi symbols. And on the right here, you see the logo for Abolish Human Abortion, which rejects the pro-life label and fights pro-life lawmakers because they are incrementalists. On the left is the German Wolfsangel. Abolish Human Abortion denies that their identifying mark is modeled after the Nazi insignia of the Wolfsangel. Be that as it may, neo-Nazis use slogans such as the infamous 14 Worlds of David Lane that appeal to abortion opponents. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. The anti-abortion and white power movements stoke each other, contributing to a climate in which white people see themselves as victims of injustice and genocide. Today's melange of right-wing militancy is nothing new, but this is the first time that all the factions convened in one place in such numbers. How did they get there? I hope now that you know. They came on different paths, making significant pivots along the way. They shifted their aims, tactics, and language along the way. They traveled different and sometimes intersecting paths, and they all arrived in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. So thank you. I look forward to the conversation and to questions that follow.
Thank you, Carol. And now, Professor Loretta Ross, I'm sure you have an analysis and some comments that you would like to share with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this program. And thank you, Carol. That was a masterful analysis. And even for someone like me who's been studying the far right and the intersection with the abortion movement for over 3 decades, you provided new information for me And the way that you did that taxonomy of the shifts was really clarifying and taught me a lot. So I want to appreciate that.
Thank you.
I started studying the far right at the Center for Democratic Renewal, which was formerly the National Anti-Klan Network. And the National Anti-Klan Network had been founded by Reverend C.T. Vivian in 1979 after 5 anti-Klan protesters were killed in Greensboro, North Carolina. Well, I joined the staff in 1990, coming from the feminist movement. And one of the things that I started noticing was that the tactics that the far right were using, the wanted posters, the tear gas attacks, the kind of things that they were talking about doing on the far right were also showing up in the anti-abortion movement. And so I started overlaying the personnel that we were monitoring in the far right with the personnel that were being documented in the anti-abortion movement. I called the project Women's Watch, and I started it in 1992. And within 6 months of us starting this project, the first abortion provider was murdered. So I knew that we were onto something because this had gone from peaceful prayers and protests into vigilante terrorism and stuff. But at this time, when I started that work and looking at the very porous membrane between the white supremacist movement and the anti-abortion movement, it was not taken seriously, as you said, Carol, between those people who monitored the far right and those people who did opposition research on the anti-abortion movement. It was kind of like we were existing in this period where people weren't taking even the threat of the far right seriously enough, in our opinion. And the only person I recall that I could get any common ground with and get any purchase was Jean Hardesty at Political Research Associates. Jean understood that the anti-feminism that we were seeing was the same anti-blackness, was the same anti-Semitism. It was all being overlaid. But that was very rare for someone who did high-level opposition research to acknowledge that. Um, but one of the other things that came to mind as you were talking, Carol, is the role of the posse comitatus thinking, the belief that there is no federal government who authority that they need to respect. And of course, that ties way back to the states' rights claims of the pro-segregationists, that they've always demonized the federal government once it started ordering the integration of the South and started dismantling all of the white supremacist protections and Jim Crow that they had. And so when you look at the way it emerged, at least in my thinking, was that you had the remnants of the anti-communist John Birch Society merging with the pro-segregationists of the South, with the Christian nationalists that were also beginning to organize around opposition to abortion, with the anti-feminists that were coming about because of the fight for the ERA and all of that, the Equal Rights Amendment and all of that, and with the anti-gay strain that was talking about, and most importantly, because this doesn't get mentioned in my mind enough, the anti-war movement that was really the rebellion of young white kids also being caught up in this, and that merged to form the Reagan Revolution and the Republican march back to power. And so one of the things that concerns me, and I wrote this article called The Nazification of the Republican Party, that they've had more than 50 years to scrape these people out of their ranks. The white supremacists, the anti-abortionists, the terrorists, all the people that we saw manifest themselves in January 6th, they've had a long time to repudiate these people, and they've chosen not to because this is the base on which they've built the modern Republican Party. And that's why they find themselves not even capable of convicting Trump, who caused the insurrection, a white insurrection at the Capitol. And so I think it's been more than time enough for us to understand that we are dealing with a very large intersectional movement, that we cannot fight them in silos. We can't just have, the Black Lives Matter movement on this side and the, reproductive justice, pro-choice movement on this side and the, gay rights movement on this side. We cannot operate in silos when our opponents are in fact seeing the membranes between their movements as non-existent because they have the same goal, which is permanent white domination of this country called America. And I would add that one of the things we noted in the 1992 research that I did was their relationship to violence ebbed and flowed depending on who was in power. So when there was a Democratic president in power, that's when they became more violent and used more extra legal means. And when there was a Republican president in power, that's when the crimes and stuff would go down a little bit, not totally disappear, of course, if you worked in abortion clinics and stuff like that. But there was that ebb and flow. But all that changed with Trump. Because when Trump came, then it was only up, up, up in terms of anti-abortion and white supremacist violence. We just saw a sharp uptick. And because he was such a norm-defying, open, in my opinion, white supremacist, because I didn't believe that his dog whistles fooled anybody, that we saw this convergence into this strong anti-democratic front, because they really are committed to not only overthrowing democracy, but they have openly stated that, through the mouthpiece of the Republican Party, even that if they cannot stay permanently in power, they would rather not have a democracy. And as Nancy Pelosi said, they're choosing their whiteness over democracy, which is true, but it's not a total statement of all of these merging trends that have come together over the last 50 years that we have to pay very close attention to. The role of anti-Semitism in all of this was very clear. Of course, they've always accused Jewish doctors of being the providers of abortion. And of course, they started that new tactic in when 2010, when they put those anti-abortion billboards up, starting in Atlanta. And I was still at Sister Song at the time, claiming that Black children are an endangered species. Well, they married their anti-Semitism with their anti-Blackness and their misogyny, while their anti-Black womanness, and claimed that we were the architects of our own genocide by working with these Jewish doctors to eliminate the Black race. And so, and the whole racialization of the abortion debate, I think, needs to be lifted up and talked about in more quarters and stuff. And the other thing, I guess, the last thing I'll say before we go into open discussion is that they've been pushing this white extinction anxiety theory for ever since, Theodore Roosevelt started talking about race suicide in defiance of the development of and the use of birth control by women, Black women, as well as the larger population. So they've been always talking about this race suicide stuff uh, that's gone on, and to try to characterize themselves as the victims of equality, the victims of progress, and basically they see themselves as the victims of the 20th century. They're trying to repeal the entire 20th century like it never happened. And so all this progress we made on civil rights, women's rights, human rights, gay rights, they just want to pretend it didn't happen. And really, I call it the unfinished Civil War, because frankly, if the people in 1865 who committed treason had been held accountable, then we wouldn't be seeing the Confederate flag still being flown in this country and shamefully at the US Capitol in the white insurrection that took place. And so we've been seeing these warning signs for a long, long time. And my biggest disappointment is those of us who call ourselves leftists or progressives or whatever we want to call ourselves have not paid attention to them as we should and given them the seriousness that they deserve. They've been preaching revolution for a long time. While we watched the ideas of the KKK march from the margins of society into mainstream public policy, we did not pay sufficient attention to how these ideas were reshaping our entire country, and particularly since they weren't using the biological determinist rhetoric of the far right, but then you saw them massaged by things like the Heritage Foundation and stuff, given economic justifications, like we just can't afford all these lazy immigrants on welfare kind of thing. And then they were given a religious mantle by the Christian nationalists. Oh, all those people are sinners, blah, blah, blah. We're the true Christian warriors. And I love your victim warrior designation as well. And then we saw them show up in our mainstream institutions and how the police treat Black folks or ignore anti-abortion violence or ignore white domestic terrorism until it's entirely too late. And so we've been watching this for 50 or 60 years. And if you read Nancy McLean's book, it's been happening since Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. And yet it has been hard to get white America not to hit the snooze button on these people. And I'm really impatient with how many pundits in the media are trying to say America is a divided country because 74 million people voted for Trump and 80 million people voted for Biden. And I'm saying that I'm calling bull on that. No, America's not divided. White America is divided about whether or not it wants to continue the Civil War or not. And that's the real conversation we need to have. And in closing, I'll say one other thing. Most of the organizations who monitored the far right in the 80s and 90s have disappeared because of the lack of funding investment in their existence. And particularly, a number of them folded when President Obama was elected because everybody just assumed we were in this post-racial period where monitoring hate groups in the far right would be no longer important. And so we've seen that once we took our eyes off of them, they never retreated. They just regrouped, reorganized, and then they ended up electing what Ta-Nehisi Coates called the first white president in Donald Trump. And so we can't afford to take our eyes off these people anymore. We can't afford to not take them lightly. And I think what is good about this present moment is that more white Americans are recognizing the danger to themselves in not taking these people serious. I mean, even when you get people like Congress people, is his name Kissinger, the one that's gotten all that hate mail from his own family, and he's a diehard Republican. He's beginning to see the danger of this neo-fascist threat that has been building forever. And the reason that the Republicans can't repudiate them, because that's their base. That's what they've been building on for 50 or 60 years. And so thank you for a masterful presentation. And you connected the dots that I just began to speculate on in the early 1990s. And yet we saw the culmination of our failure to pay attention to these people on January 6th with the seriousness that they deserve. And I'll just close and say, I don't think the Republican Party has any legitimate claim to be seen as a respectable political party anymore when they have been taken over by this neo-fascist urge, and they have cowed everyone else who should be in resistance to them into silence and cowardice, And I'm not necessarily, gonna send awards to the 10 Republicans who broke ranks, because they're part of the problem. They coddled it too long, and waking up after the riot is a little bit too late.
Thank you, Loretta, for your really brilliant, thoughtful commentary, and Carol for your presentation and connecting the dots, and to Sean Steiner for making this all work. I'm going to share some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat and the questions and answers, and hopefully slip in a few of my own. The first question I will answer, though, is yes, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available afterwards. One of the questions is from Carol Jaffe, and this is really, I think I'd love to hear both of your answers. Given, there's this contradiction. So given the deep hostility to people of color and the worries about the diminishing white majority in the United States, why oppose abortion when the opposition at the same time is claiming that legal abortion leads to a Black genocide and points to the disproportionate rate of abortion among Black women?
You want me to take that, Carol?
You go first.
Well, first of all, one thing that people who are opposed to human rights always do is that they're strikingly unoriginal, because they end up trying to take and wrap their mantles around the things that we promote as human rights activists. So they've been trying to co-opt the concept of civil rights and equality for a long, long time. And so starting, a couple of decades ago, they started trying to say that the predominantly white anti-abortion movement cares more about Black lives than Black women. That's been a narrative that they've been running for a long time. But what has been more recent is in the last couple of decades, they've actually been able to pay Black spokespeople to run that line as well. And people like Alveda King and on to run this self-genocide analysis by Black people, by Black women in particular, and of course being manipulated by Jewish doctors in the quote abortion industry. Now, specifically in 2010, these billboards started appearing all over America, but they started in Atlanta, a few blocks from the Sister Song office. And the first billboard I saw said that the most dangerous place for a Black child is in the womb. And this happened on a Monday morning. And by the time I got to my office as a Sister Song, there was this barrage of phone calls from the media, because apparently they had sent out press releases saying they were going to put up these billboards. And then, they were calling me and all the reproductive justice organizations for comments. But what they're trying to do, first of all, is claim that they're the true civil rights movement, which is lies, because they are the ones, if you look at who's in their ranks, they fight every civil rights bill that ever was presented at their desk. They're trying to also promote what they call PRENDA legislation, Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act, claiming that babies are being discriminated in the womb because of their race and gender. And I think they even called it something outlandish like this Susan B. Anthony Frederick Douglass Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act. So they actually spit on us as they appropriate our names and our causes. And they're trying to claim that women in general are coerced into having abortion, so that women who have, this was a previous narrative. First, women who have abortions were the victims. Now they're the murderers. So like Carol was talking about, the shifting narratives. But particularly that Asian American women were being coerced into having abortions because of the sex of the fetus. And then Black women were being coerced into having abortions because of the race of the fetus. Well, of course, that analysis was just stupid, because I've never met a Black woman who would be surprised that her baby was going to be Black. So she wasn't having an abortion because of the race of the fetus. And I'm not convinced that son preference exists in the United States. As a matter of fact, when people have done a limited number of studies on gender preference around abortions, is finding out that there's actually a female preference in the United States. And so their arguments, like Carol says, are anti-scientific. That's basically BS. But they do try to get these PRENDA bills passed, and I think they're the results of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, where they do these model legislations across many states, which is why they pop up so simultaneously. And the people are caught off guard. We're like, why is the same bill over here, over here, over here, and over here? because there is intense coordination of it. But we have to discredit these people that are trying to racialize the abortion debate. We created the concept of trust Black women. We can make our own decisions. We're not anybody's dupes. As a matter of fact, before Margaret Sanger even started her campaign for birth control, Black women had reduced our fertility rate and cut it in half between 1865 and 1910. We have always fought for reproductive self-determination. And we're not going to let these bozos who are trying to racialize the debate or the church or men or the government tell us what to do with our lives and our bodies, because we know we live up under a white supremacist construct. And we certainly aren't going to believe white supremacists who tell us that they know better what to do for us than we know for ourselves, because we've had no problem detecting the white supremacists that are trying to racialize the abortion debate and weaponize it against us. But I should close by saying one other thing. They started this billboard campaign right when President Obama was elected. Right after the November election, they met at St. Simon's Island, right off the coast of Georgia, to start this racialized billboard campaign that swept the country. So they knew that they could strategically try to point a dagger at President Obama's Black female support, which was to strengthening the Democratic Party. They wanted to drive a gender wedge in the Black community by getting Black men to oppose abortion rights, and they wanted to drive a racial wedge in the pro-choice movement by accusing them of being genocidal, following in the footsteps of Margaret Sanger, who they demonized, and all this thing. So it was hitting a lot of buttons for them to racialize the abortion debate all at the same time. But we fought them back. We defeated that bill here in Georgia, and we continue to fight them across the country.
Carol?
I'll only add to that. Thank you, Carol Jaffe, for that question. One of the reasons why I went to Louisville in 2017 was I wasn't really researching this stuff, but it just struck me that there was this sort of Operation Rescue type siege in Louisville, and I went there and I stayed in the hotel where all the aunties were staying, and I took these pictures in the parking lot, and I went there explicitly looking for overt white supremacist imagery to see how much overlap there was between white supremacists and anti-abortionists. And if you'll remember, 2017 was when we had not only Charlottesville, but in Pikesville, Kentucky, there was a convening of white supremacists. And so there was this confluence going on here. And I wondered how much that would overlap. And what I found was I didn't see what I thought I would see, but as you saw in some of the pictures that I shared with you, I understood other things, like this idea of becoming oppositional to the federal government, right? But to go back to Carol Jaffe's original question, there has been some research on right-wing movements and white supremacists and how they fall on the abortion issue, because basically, as you might guess, they're all for abortions for some people, right? And so they're a little bit, it depends on race, you know, if they're all for abortions if they're people of color. So they don't line up exactly, but it is all motored by this fear of demographic demise.
Thank you. So here's a question. Carol, you brought up the doctrine of lesser magistrates. You know, you don't have to follow the law when it's wrong, if that's not too simplifying of it. And I just wondered how you would compare that to the principles of civil disobedience and principles that we might very well be called upon on our side to make much more use of, should Roe be overturned, should abortion become even less accessible. And I, for one, even though abortions are not done for political purposes, the millions of women who've had illegal abortions, who have abortions anyway, were in fact engaging in a form of civil disobedience. So I was wondering if you could clarify those things.
I think the main difference there is the word civil. And the second thing is that, to the best of my understanding, the civil disobedience is in disobedience of a system that people still think is, still trying to sway that system to our side of thinking. So it's not so much, it's more about reforming, like this is wrong, but this part of it is wrong. And we want to get the people in power to see that this is wrong. And so civil disobedience is sort of to try and persuade those people in power that you have to include what we're fighting for. The difference with the right-wing version and the doctrine of the lesser magistrates is that they have gone to the oppositional far right, right? And so they're saying that the existing system is absolutely the problem. They're not right-to-lifers trying to make laws or even pro-lifers trying to, make sure that we have some kind of culture of life, those different rhetorics. They're really saying and joining with the far right and saying that that the rule of law doesn't matter at all anymore, and that this whole system of the United States doesn't work for us anymore. And so it's a much more revolutionary stance than I think of what we see with various episodes of civil disobedience in United States history.
Here's another question. This is from Justine Lyons. Would you say, and this is to both of you, that increasingly xenophobic and inflammatory rhetoric about border security, immigration, and refugee arrivals have exacerbated the far-right anti-abortion movement, in addition to white supremacists, alt-right, anti-feminist, anti-Semitic sentiments that drive it?
Well, I think it's all connected. I mean, white supremacy has been the doctrine of this country since it committed genocide against Native Americans. And we have to remember the 1924 Anti-Immigration Act and the fact that the same year that bill was passed, the first laws against miscegenation or race mixing were passed. And so we can't treat white supremacy like it's a new arrival because of Trump. He was a symptom of it. He wasn't the cause of it. It is written into this country's DNA. And when you talk about the increasing crimes against Asian Americans, the increasing crimes against Mexican Americans and people coming across the border, that's been going on. But what is interesting about this turn is the vicious violence that people are accepting as the new normal now. I mean, the way that it was accepted when lynchings were far more prevalent. Matter of fact, I still think lynchings are still going on because I just don't believe that all these little Black children being kidnapped are instantly suicidal, like the police like to say. But the rhetoric around the borders, the dilution of the white breeding stock, all this stuff is written into the DNA of the United States. It has always been there. It's just that sometimes it becomes more obvious, becomes more prevalent, and even more rarely, the national media notices it and talks about it. But it's always been there. And what surprises me, probably more than anything else, is that we have a country that can look at those children in cages on the border and pretend that there's a pro-life movement in this country that cares about children, because obviously they don't.
Right. There's that hypocrisy, and I think that on that separation of families at the border, I speculate. I haven't done any research to back this up, but this struck me as first and foremost an affront to the immigrants themselves and immigrant families, and a warning of for immigrants who were in the country But secondarily, it was, I think, to stoke some of the anger, and to be a sort of nod to those, to the xenophobes and to the racists and to the white supremacists, to say, look, this is what I'm doing. This is here it is as much a communication to them as it was to the people who were actually trying to come into the country and to people who advocate for immigrant rights. I think it was it had communication to the far right as well.
And as a matter of history, we know that abortion became illegal in the United States at a moment when white birth rates were falling and there was an increase in immigration and extraordinary xenophobia. So we see these patterns, partly which tells me that there are things that we can do. People say, what can we do? And certainly Loretta's comment about we have to stop working in silos is so key to that. At the same time, we are trying to make change inside of huge social demographic shifts and economic shifts that none of us individually in any case control, and even collectively we have only so much power over. But I would be remiss when we're talking about children in cages and separation of immigrant families, not to mention that there's a massive separation of families in the United States. It's called the child welfare system. It's primarily Black and poor white families and other poor families of color. And a new organization, Movement for Family Power, is documenting that and its intersectionality with the war on drugs. By the way, Carol, I love how you connect the 1980s and 90s to the war on drugs and the militarization of abortion. I just want to say that it was the war on drugs that militarized the police, that gave the police the weapons, the military weapons they have that they use when they break into people's home, Breonna Taylor's and others. And it's a complete setup. If they can go in with that level of firearms for marijuana and drugs that make people feel good, imagine what they might do if they believed that people had the safe and effective medications, misoprostol and mifepristone, in their homes.
Or you got the QAnon people believing that trafficked children are arriving in Wayfair boxes. I mean, so there's no limits to what a deluded people can believe to justify their violence. But I keep telling people all across the country, they don't do what they do because of what we do in resistance. Fascists do what they do because that's who they are. And so the reality is that their only currency is violence. The only way they can seize and maintain power is violence. And I think that I'm tired of people telling me and others like me that we're overstating the case by calling them fascists. I actually think we're right on and finally they revealed who they are and what their intention is to overthrow this government. And we have to call them for what they are and stop tiptoeing around and just saying they're angry patriots. They went past the angry patriot title 30 years ago when they started ordering people again.
If I can jump on that, the thing I think, Loretta, that will make it apparent to people is if there is more of a unifying ideology and not just a sentiment, right? So that's what I've been hearing a bunch of different students, scholars of right-wing studies saying is that that what we didn't have at January 6th and with Trump was some overarching vision for a new state, right? In the way that there was with Hitler, for example.
But Hitler learned from America, not America learns from Hitler. Oh, I'm sorry. We were the original white supremacist state. Hitler came here and studied our Jim Crow segregation as a way to create the template for the fascism he wanted. So I don't know who these people are that says, well, we need a unifying ideology. Our unifying ideology is hidden in plain sight, and it's called white supremacy. And I'm surprised and disappointed that people think that they've got to find a new set of words to describe what is so obvious to its victims.
I think the way it's going to pan out is I'm guessing that it may be an accelerated and amplified version of America First. I think that may be the banner under which this particular iteration will or could emerge in a bad way.
Again, I agree it may be euphemized, but you can't hide its ugly skeleton with the euphemism because it's been there all along. And I mean, Trump is not an ideologue, but that doesn't mean he's not a fascist. Sorry, you don't have to actually have a coherent ideology to behave in a very fascistic way. So I think that's too high a bar for those who wanted to resemble the classic models from Germany and Italy.
Well, and I think you're very right about that. That we tend to think about fascism as a top-down kind of thing, and that is not the model I think that is operating here. I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for just to get through a few more questions. Rebecca Costantini says, really fascinating conversations. You're getting amazing compliments in the questions in the chat. She's wondering to both of you if you could speak to the role of CPCs, crisis pregnancy centers, in holding the white supremacist infrastructure, and how CPCs will continue to be a vehicle to espouse white supremacy over the next decade.
All I know about CPCs, I'll say real fast, is that when I have my students map out the CPCs, they could tell just by using Google Maps where those CPCs are placed, and that it's usually around universities and communities of color. And so I think that there may be an answer in there, but I haven't really studied CPCs, so I'm not gonna venture into that too much.
Well, I mean, crisis pregnancy centers are the leading edge of the anti-science people. I mean, they are the ones that mainstream the anti-science sentiment that, you can have a partial abortion, that abortion will cause cancer, that they promote all these myths. But the biggest myth is that they actually care about the people once the baby's born, and so they really traffic in lies and misdirections and stuff. There's also not surprising, a large number of them located in near and around abortion clinics, and they do this deceptive advertising so the person thinks that they're coming there for abortion services and ends up at one of the CPCs. But they're one of the original propagators of bad science around abortion. And so I don't see them as, grandma's knitting places, but really people who are willing to traffic in conspiracy and anti-science BS to manipulate people, and this is what they do.
And I would add that you can check out reproaction.org, direct action group, that among its work was targeting CPCs and exposing the fact that they were doing nothing about Black maternal mortality and forcing an exposure of their junk science and misdirection. We also have a question from Cynthia Gorney. Your connecting of symbols, language, names, etc., is powerful and fascinating. The tension between violent opposition and rebellion and working within the system goes back 50 years with the right to life, as you know. Do you think that's changed dramatically, or is it maybe just more visible to outsiders and able to rouse more group violent action now because of social media and because of the Trump inaugurated an anti-fact, anti-science era more intense than in any decade? So more encouragement and more alliances.
I don't know if the anti-science stuff is more intense. I mean, I do remember the Scopes monkey trial. Not that I was alive for it, but the whole question of whether or not evolution could be taught in schools and stuff. I mean, again, these are not new narratives. These are things that have been happening for a long time in this country. And we teach history so badly that we think all this stuff is new because it's the first time we've encountered it. But no, it's very much there if we connect the dots and look at our true history and not the narratives, the false narratives that we're all taught within the educational system of the United States. But Carol, you may have more to add to that. But one thing's changed and what they say the same as far as I'm concerned.
I don't know. I think the heart of the question is this idea of what kind of violence we're seeing and who's and if it's going to escalate. And I rather suspect that it will as we roll on. And I do suspect that some of it will be overt anti-abortion violence. But I think that there will probably be more blurred lines.
And I think one thing I would say in conclusion is that there is going to be an uptick in violence because since the 80s, they've been using Louis Beam's leaderless resistance strategy so that they're operating apparently as lone wolves, but in fact, there is a strategic coordination that's taking place. And so we're going to see many more vulnerable people being attacked. I think that they're going to go after the infrastructure of this country because they want to bring democracy to its knees. And this is what they're going to do. And as long as the people who are supposed to be the guardians of democracy don't take them seriously, they're going to be emboldened and take even greater, more dramatic steps. And so I fully expect that. And I'm just surprised that with all the might of our national security apparatus, that they can't find these people because they're choosing not to look.
Or that there's confusion in there.
Well, so they don't all wear sheets, some wear blue.
Yeah. And I think your point about infrastructure is really important. And I remember that someone said that the far right in Europe was watching January 6th in the Capitol, like watching it unfold like a soccer match. And my guess is that a lot of people are watching what's happening in, for example, Texas now with the catastrophe on catastrophe on catastrophe. They might be watching that as a soccer match too. In other words, they might be looking at that going like, wow, how can we reproduce that level of chaos by attacking infrastructures?
Right. And America is signaling that it is on the verge of being a totally failed state because of 50 years of anti-infrastructure policies, dealing with domestic terrorism, holding a political party accountable. I mean, we have done all the wrong things that are converging at a very precarious time in the history of this country.
Thank you both so much. We just have a few minutes left. I want to close by thanking both of you. I also wanted to mention, Loretta, in answer to one of the questions, you talked about many of the things being connected. And I heard you frame it this way, that it's all part of the same fabric of hatred, which I thought was a beautiful way to describe it. We will be sending people the link for this. I'm not sure if we can send the chat. Somebody asked about that. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll make them available to our presenters and see if they can follow up if they have the time to do that. And I guess the last question, though, is there any, given what we've learned today and given the very big challenges that face us, are there things from anti-fascist movements that have inspired you, that could inspire others, that we could leave folks with?
I'm going to go first because I want to let Loretta have the last word. I think one of the things that I would suggest is not to internalize apocalyptic thinking yourself. In other words, be rational and think through what the problems are and approach them with collaborations and together. But don't get so overwhelmed and start to think that there is only them and only us. Stop thinking don't recreate the apocalyptic form where there's only them and only us. We have to create collaborations, and don't fall into that trap where you feel like everything is going to ultimately go downhill, because I see a lot of vitality, I see a lot of creativity in oppositional movements, and I think that we need to look to those.
I want to speak to the transnational nature of this global fascist threat and the fact that we in the United States have a lot we can learn from the global South in dealing with dictators, in dealing with insurrectionists, in dealing with people who are overthrowing democracy and have made a recovery from that. We need to humble ourselves to learn, because this is not so unique to the United States. We are not that exceptional. This has happened before and may happen again. And we need to study countries that have put up guardrails against this stuff happening, because we were too ill prepared because we believed the myth of our own greatness, that American exceptionalism thing. And when it found out that we're susceptible to a tin pot dictator like anybody else, it's a humbling and sobering thing. I do join Carol in saying, yeah, but we're not giving up. And the point, I guess I'll close with this. Every white demographic voted for Donald Trump, just like white people have voted for white supremacy for as long as there's been this designated thing called white people, except young white people, the 18 to 29%, 18 to 29 years old kids. They voted for Biden. That's the first generation of white people who have voted against white supremacy. And so I take a lot of hope in the fact that the older generations may be a lost cause, but the younger people, we got them. We got them with our framework, with our honesty, with our truth, with our music, with our culture, and with our cool. So I take a lot of comfort in that.
That's a beautiful place to end this. So I and National Advocates for Pregnant Women, thank you both very much.
Thank you for having us.